If we start focusing on our cognitive health early on, about 80% of dementias could be prevented. That's the most expensive disease in the world.
At any moment in our life, we do have that pathology in our brain right now. I do have the process of Alzheimer's disease going on. But if I eat better and if I exercise and if I keep an eye on my blood pressure, my cholesterol as I age in my 40s, I will reduce that risk.
How far away do you think we are from having clinical pharmaceutical drugs which can reverse Alzheimer's so it doesn't become this sort of death sentence?
I think we're fairly close. One thing I'm going to tell people is going to shock them.
Dean, Ayesha, thank you so much for joining me. I'm glad we finally made this work after all of our respective illnesses each time.
Thank
you so much for having us, Karan. This is I'm overjoyed. I love what you do. We love your conversations. Thank you for your page and for the information that you spread out, especially in an era where there's so much health misinformation. You really are a breath of fresh air out there in the social media. So thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, likewise. I really love the sort of neuroscience, neurology content you guys put out. And particularly, I mean, you guys have this deep domain expertise in dementia and Alzheimer's. And that is something that I'm increasingly concerned about for my own family members and myself as well, because traditionally, a lot of people think of Alzheimer's or any dementias as an old person disease. Mm-hmm. And although the clinical manifestations might present in 60s, 70s, and 80s, I think people should be focusing on that potentially in their 20s and 30s, because it seems the habits, the lifestyles, the seeds of our vices, anything we do, are sown in our second and third decades, and they'll only manifest later on. So do you think more people should be focusing on actually brain health and preventative health against Alzheimer's, in their early age, in their early life?
Absolutely. Alzheimer's is not one disease. As you know, many diseases start with a catch-all category. And what happens is, as we become more sophisticated in our ability to distill, to separate the different parts, you realize that these are different kind of diseases that come down to the same endpoint. There is a genetic component of Alzheimer's. Of course, all diseases have genetic components. We are all genetic beings. Even our behaviors, how we drive, have to some extent influence from our genes. But the penetrance matters. The penetrance of the gene varies. There are diseases that are 100% driven by genes. These are called 100% penetrant genes. Huntington's disease. If you have that horrible gene, and I've had patients, and I've had to tell their kids that anomalies on chromosome 4, we know what that means. That means that by age 30-something, they're going to get it. And it's a horrible, horrible disease that hopefully in the next decade or so, we'll find genetic engineering for it. But for Alzheimer's, 100% penetrant genes account for 3% of all Alzheimer's. 3%. And for much of dementia, it's a small number, meaning that if you have that gene, you're going to get the disease. It's presenilin-1, presenilin-2, and APP. But the rest of Alzheimer's is a interplay between genes and environment. And we know that interplay. There's about 40 genes or more. And the environment is what determines the manifestation of that disease. And that starts early.
I'm actually pretty surprised myself, because when most people think about Alzheimer's and dementia, there's the often misassociation, and they sort of think both are interchangeable words. And I think more people are slowly realizing that dementia is an umbrella term for Alzheimer's. But actually what you said there, that Alzheimer's itself is another catch-all phrase and an umbrella and a spectrum of different subtypes of Alzheimer's, that's actually pretty interesting. So to actually suggest that there may be a component which is non-modifiable, you may be predisposed significantly towards Alzheimer's, and then there could be a spectrum of Alzheimer's where actually it can be significantly prevented through lifestyle changes. That is, I think, quite surprising and an interesting takeaway.
It is that. And this is the journey of human history, comfort with complexity. When people say things like common sense, I cringe. The world around you is not common sense. It's complexity, and our journey is to become comfortable with complexity. And that's what medicine is. We're learning that ADHD is not just ADHD; it's a spectrum phenomenon. And the same thing with dementia. Dementia is the umbrella category. So it's almost like saying cancer, right? Cancer is not one cancer. There are many types. Alzheimer's constitutes about 60 to 70% of all dementias, but you have other dementias like frontotemporal lobe dementia, Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's dementia, Huntington's dementia, metabolic dementias, alcohol-related dementias, and many others. And each of them have different pathways. But even within Alzheimer's, there are different pathways that lead you to the final direction. You've heard people say things like Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. Well, yeah, but one aspect that could push you to that precipice is uncontrolled diabetes or even insulin resistance. We've done research when we were directors of brain health at Cedars-Sinai on insulin resistance, and the influence of insulin resistance is profound. This is not to scare people. I really think that when I give information like this, people might get scared, but they should also get empowered because it's actionable. We found in a NHANES study. NHANES is a large database. We love large databases. And we did a study there and we published it that even 50-year-olds with insulin resistance that was not treated, their cognitive state was lower. Now, that's one paper. I always go the extra mile of even downgrading our own papers because at Instagram, one case study becomes a whole movement. I want people to be comfortable with not even one clinical trial is end all be all. It has to be a stream of data in one direction. Then you say there seems to be strong evidence there. But insulin resistance untreated can have influence on your brain. And here's the rub. And here's the opportunity. A significant portion of the world, especially first world or a developed world, US, UK, and others, have insulin resistance. That's prediabetes. And if insulin resistance is addressed, cognitive state is addressed. And as you said it beautifully at the beginning, if we start focusing on our cognitive health early on, for a great majority, I would say, and this is extrapolation, and it's a meaningful extrapolation from large data, is that about 80% of dementias could be prevented. That's the most expensive disease in the world. The second most expensive disease in America alone is heart disease at $120 billion. Alzheimer's alone is $500 billion. So that's just financial. The human cost is beyond those measures, but we can prevent those. And then the last thing before I pass off to the better half is that, and this is very important. Nowadays, a lot of big names are coming out saying things like they can reverse Alzheimer's. And when we wrote our first book, they said, just hint at that and you'll sell extra 2 million books. We said, we can't because we're in the field. We know the pathology. Alzheimer's cannot be prevented through lifestyle at this point. Once it's set in, prevented it can be, reversed it can't. Once somebody's in the thralls of Alzheimer's, that pathology, we know it can't be reversed. That's a gimmick. There are more pejorative terms that I could use to play on people's hopes. So yeah, there's so much hope on the prevention side.
The 2024 Lancet Commission report suggested that 45% of Alzheimer's dementia cases could be prevented through lifestyle changes. And as you just mentioned in your book and what you're saying now, 80% and beyond could be prevented. Do you think there's some discrepancy and it's actually heavily weighted on those lifestyle changes, and maybe the Lancet and other medical institutions are underplaying the amount of preventative help that we could take by modifying these lifestyle factors?
As I said, mine is extrapolation. Ours is extrapolation. I say that out loud, and so that people know the difference between extrapolation. It's a good extrapolation. What they've done is go on raw data, which is good, which is blunt, which is a very conservative approach. This is lifestyle that's somewhat good. It's a data that's marginally in the right direction. And even then, 45%. I mean, if you found a drug for Alzheimer's that reduced the risk by 45%, it would be $1 trillion drug. So what I was trying to say is they were using the most conservative data possible, and still they came up with 45%. But if you speak to the fact that we know that nutrition, when done well and optimally, reduces risk even more than 45% by itself, exercise by itself, then you see that the numbers are much better. But I love the circumspect, more conservative, more careful approach that Lancet took, which is still 45%.
And if you look at the trend, Karan, just about 10 years ago, when somebody would talk about dementia prevention, it was scoffed at. It was something that was out of the woo-woo box. And, they would say that, no, it's not preventable at all. And then slowly and gradually, and as a medical student, as a resident and a fellow going to all of these Alzheimer's Association conferences, you would see that every single year there would be some nugget of prevention. It was essentially a potluck at the basement in the conference. And then suddenly it got its own section, and then it was platform. And back in 2018, the first time the plenary session of Alzheimer's Association conference was about prevention, where Mia Kivipalto, the finger study, the Finnish geriatric study, PI and the team came and said that finally we now have objective evidence that Alzheimer's can be prevented. And I remember like people standing up and giving, a standing ovation for that. It was such a huge issue, but it's a good time to be alive as a neurologist, and especially those of us who deal with dementia and diseases of cognition, knowing that there's so much that we can do to empower our patients and also look at it very differently. Like you said, you started the conversation in a beautiful way, Karan, saying that we always thought that this was a disease that was reserved for later years, but we now know that we can actually do a lot about it. If you look at the Lancet Commission paper, there's this beautiful diagram that I show to my patients and to my community members, and it essentially is a beautiful path of how the modifiable risk factors impact you, whether you're in early life, midlife, and late life. In early life, we have education as one of the risk factors. And education is essentially a proxy for cognitive activities. So that's a factor. In midlife, so many. It's way more than what your factors are in your later life. And then there are some things that are added to them, which we can talk about later. Like, for example, this year, this latest version actually added LDL cholesterol as one of the risk factors for dementia. They also added vision loss as one of the factors in later years. So every time they come up with data, they become more nuanced. They look at all the factors that impact our cognition over years. So it's a really exciting time.
Now, one thing the field of Alzheimer's and dementia research in general, it seems to follow this sort of peaks and troughs where you get this excitement built up, and then that unfortunately seems to be cruelly shattered by some sort of scandal or limitation in evidence. I think, the tau protein sort of paper that was found to be sort of based on, slightly dodgy data, which kind of, I guess, ruined some enthusiasm for the research. And more recently, these newer drugs which came out, which claim to reverse early stage Alzheimer's, the lecanemab and other similar drugs like that. And that initially hit the headlines and everyone was talking about a breakthrough in Alzheimer's. But then, most members of the public weren't privy to the nuance that this was in very early stage Alzheimer's, and actually the results didn't seem very clinically significant in terms of the memory and cognition scores, which actually were improved. It didn't seem significantly great. And, you see one thing in headlines, Alzheimer's reversal drugs, but in clinical practice, it doesn't seem like such a thing. How far away do you think we are from having clinical pharmaceutical drugs which can reverse Alzheimer's so it doesn't become this sort of death sentence if you have mid to advanced Alzheimer's?
I think we're fairly close. And I mean it by this sense. We have to be a little nuanced here. Depends where you are in the disease process. If you're pre-disease and you already know you have risk, let's say you have two ApoE4 genes, which are the high-risk genes. This is one of the genes that increases risk. If you have one gene, your risk goes up as much as 4 times. If you have 2 alleles, it goes up as much as 12 times. Even then, it doesn't mean that you're 100% going to get the disease. We know that lifestyle has a lot to do with that because ApoE4 is a lipid transport protein byproduct. So we know that if you identify early, there's a lot that can be done now. And in the near future, I think majority of these cases will be curative. And I think I'm as a responsible scientist, I shouldn't give dates, but I am so optimistic that within this decade, we will see some remarkable preventive medications aside from lifestyle itself. Lifestyle itself is incredibly helpful. Once a person has the disease, let's say they've been diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's in particular, then it's a little bit more difficult because you're really now down a slippery slope. We're talking about a cascade, and there the amyloid and tau pathway has started. We've never abandoned the amyloid and tau. We just say now that for a great majority, amyloid and tau is not upstream, it's downstream, meaning that once all the lifestyle stuff have pushed you to the precipice, now the amyloid and tau start the damage. And by that time, the cascade is so destructive, pulling back is next to impossible. For people that say that they reverse Alzheimer's, they don't know what tau does. Tau is almost like a virus. It's almost like a glue that keeps binding to the next tau, to the next tau, to the next cell. And reversing that at this point with lifestyle is impossible. Mm-hmm. But there will be drugs that will attach to the phospho-tau, that will detach it, that will disintegrate it, they'll stop the machinery of tau. Yes, all that is not just foreseeable. The people are working on it. And I'm very optimistic about that. So that's the optimistic view. Even with my patients, responsibly and without false hope, I say, let's keep you healthy. Let's keep your mind active. And we talk about the 5 elements: nutrition, exercise, stress, sleep, and mental activity and social activity. Keep these going. And then in the next 5 to 10 years, we believe with strong evidence that there will be curative drugs.
What are your thoughts on this kind of growing body of evidence that we're getting constantly with the research, particularly from the trials of semaglutide, tirzepatide, that these GLP-1 agonists, GIP-1 agonists can actually have some positive impact at reducing the incidence of Alzheimer's and, provide some sort of long-term cognitive benefit? Do you think that is some causative mechanism beyond just improving the metabolic profile and insulin sensitivity? Is there something about these drugs, do you think, can provide independent, direct brain benefits?
Yeah, so if you look at some of the processes that propel the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's disease, if you had to group them, it would essentially be mainly 4. It's inflammation, it's oxidation, glucose dysregulation, and lipid or fat dysregulation. It seems that the GLP-1 medication impact the inflammation and the oxidation branches of it. So far, we have very little data, and a lot of it is hypothetical. But some of the signals from human data have shown some promise, and it's still being investigated. But I'm very excited with what the papers and what the data has shown. And so it's a newer medication and a drug in the list of a different group of medication out there. And as we said earlier, it seems like one can go or reach to that point of pathogenesis of Alzheimer's disease from multiple ways, and inflammation seems to be a major part of it. So I'm excited to actually have that in the mix.
So, a lot of these, someone who has kind of advanced Alzheimer's or who's been diagnosed and is probably on that pathway to losing a significant degree of independence in their lifestyle, they may become, quite dependent on the state for sort of healthcare, on family members. So there's a rising cost when it comes to their own healthcare needs as, their Alzheimer's progresses. In this current age of personalized medicine and consumer health, where people have wearables, are doing full body MRIs for better or for worse, do you think there's also a role in which people do, become proactive and screen for these high-risk alleles and high-risk genes for Alzheimer's? Because I guess the argument is, on one side, it can provoke health anxiety if you are found to have these high-risk genes for Alzheimer's. But on the other side, given what you've said earlier, 80% or more can be, the burden can be reduced potentially by lifestyle changes. Knowing that you are high risk for Alzheimer's, but not predetermined Alzheimer's in your 20s or 30s, may provide you a window of at least give you a bit of a scare and maybe provide you that momentum to really capitalize on those lifestyle changes?
So knowing your risk is important, but knowing your risk and whether it's actionable is even more important. With ApoE4, we are a little closer to that. Just a few years ago, if somebody said, check your ApoE4, we would be a little incredulous and worried. Both of us met 22 years ago thousands of miles away while we were trying to volunteer and help. We were from that background. And our first conversation was about our grandparents. Ayesha's amazing grandfather died from Alzheimer's, and mine the same. And she has a very strong family history, as I do as well. And if you find out that you have the ApoE4 gene back then, and there's nothing much you can do, and you do get active, a lot of people will get into the cycle of anxiety and depression, and that actually is part of the risk factor. So it's critical that we do things that are actionable. Otherwise, we open ourselves to these charlatans that have panels that are, 100 tests at a time, and then just the nature of bell curve. If you test 100 tests on anybody, they will have one of them be outside of the normal, and they say, oh, there it is. That's my vitamin concoction right there. So it's critical that we are careful about this. So I think the way people should do this is, if we think there is a anomaly and there's a potential treatment for it, definitely do so. Other than that, your motivation should be this. Your motivation should be that every time you do one extra thing, and we will talk about this in specifics, walking on a regular basis, brisk walk, not sexy, just brisk walk, reduces your risk of Alzheimer's by as much as 40%. Eating a cup of greens, that reduces your risk significantly. So the empowering factor is, by doing small, meaningful, stepwise things, you can profoundly improve your brain health. And that's important. But as far as doing tests and then being subject to people saying, oh, this vitamin concoction and that vitamin concoction, I think that's the risk that one faces when people do big panels of lab tests.
And if I may add to that, I have this conversation with my patients all the time. Should I get tested because my mom or my grandmother had the disease? I really want to know what my risk is. And I'm all for empowering people to get to know about their genetic background and if there's anything that they can do about it. I also think that it's very important for people to know that if they don't necessarily have the genes, it doesn't mean that they're risk-free. And this is not fear-mongering per se, but there's such a huge overlap between vascular risk factors and neurological diseases and neurodegenerative conditions that, regardless of having any particular gene, we are going to accumulate risks as we get older. And it's very important for people to know that Alzheimer's disease is essentially a cumulative condition. At any moment in our life, whether it's you, Karan, or myself, or Dean, we do have that pathology in our brain right now. I do have the process of Alzheimer's disease going on. But if I eat better and if I exercise and if I keep an eye on my blood pressure, my cholesterol as I age in my 40s, I will reduce that risk. I know that if I don't sleep well, that would actually speed up the accumulation of beta amyloid protein that could potentially harm my brain cells. So I have to couch it with that perception, to say that just because you don't have the genes doesn't mean you're absolutely fine to do whatever you want. Take care of yourselves, and the way you eat, the way you live for your heart health, your brain is going to benefit from it as well.
So it seems like a very dynamic process that, you've got a constant evolution of high risk versus low risk. And I guess similarly, even though someone may be predisposed to something, predisposition doesn't equal predetermination.
Oh, no. Your brain is the most resilient organ. We have 87 billion neurons. That's just the beginning. We have a quadrillion potential connections, 100 trillion operations per second. And it's ever evolving, ever adapting. It does some of its best work during sleep. Whereas every other part of your body rests, your brain is working, it's cleansing. It is so resilient and so powerfully changing all the time. So to take it in that sense, everything you do can build to this infrastructure or decay. And pathology does not cognitive outcome make. Let me give you an example. There are two very cute studies. One is the London taxi driver study, very apropos here. And then the second one is the nun study. I'll focus on the nun study. There's a group of several hundred nuns, and we mean the habit and everything, that dedicated their blood, their diaries, their history, their labs, everything, including imaging, as well as their brain to science after they passed away. And what they found was a group of them passed away and their brain was inundated with pathology, little microvascular disease, shrunken brain, all of that. Yet during life, they were normal. So how is it that this inundated with disease, brain was still normal, and not just normal, doing very well? And then another group, again, group is important because it was a meaningful number of people, the nuns that had very, pristine brains, not that much pathology, yet they had succumbed to Alzheimer's. So the first instinct was genetics. It must be genetics. This group that was inundated with disease, yet didn't have Alzheimer's, must have the lower risk genes, and this one must have high risk. Nope, that wasn't the case. Then they looked at labs, they looked at everything else. These are nuns, so pretty much same habits, except one thing. They looked at their diaries, and the content of the diaries was very different. The nuns that were protected in spite of pathology had much more complex vocabulary, much more in-depth writing, as opposed to the ones that had succumbed. Now, of course, this is superficial. It was some of the first studies, but it did give us a window into what my favorite term, idea density. I always say, if I ever develop a musical band, which would be even if I live 5 lives, that's going to be a while. I'm a terrible guitar player. But if I had a band, it would be called idea density. Idea density matters. And that's just one of the variables, which means people who challenge their brain, work their brain throughout their life, actually created protection. And that's why there is no valid study that doesn't have education as a part of it. And why do we use education? Because it's easy to, as a number, 12 years of school, 14 years of school, 16 years of school. But actually, it's not education. It's level of mental activity. It's incredibly protective because these neurons can make 2 connections or as many as 30,000 connections. Imagine that. So a neuron that makes 30,000 connections, even if a few of them are severed from trauma, bad weekend, some too much partying, yet the rest of them are still connected. Those connections persevere, and that matters. So we have a lot of data that there are so many elements in your life that can add to that resilience, to that growth throughout your life. And it's very optimistic.
That's I think that nun study there correlates pretty well with an interesting study published in the British Medical Journal, where I think it was in the Christmas edition, where they tracked surgeons in the UK, and actually an abnormally high number of surgeons experienced some degree of morbidity and mortality after retiring. Suggesting that as soon as the cognitive load decreases rapidly, there's also a rapid acceleration of cognitive decline potentially as well. And we've spoken already about a lot of those factors which can contribute and associated with cognitive decline in Alzheimer's. I think there's, roughly around 14. We've spoken about the sort of value, the huge output you get from, just even minimal input of exercise, the physical activity. You've spoken about the education aspect, or maybe, not education, but keeping your brain active throughout life, music, learning new languages, hobbies, reading, whatever. I wanted to touch on something, Ayesha, that you spoke about, which is this sort of new factor that's been proposed about LDL cholesterol. And I think generally the science has flip-flopped so much on cholesterol, over the last couple of decades. And sometimes, that sort of dumbing down of cholesterol is useful, and sometimes maybe not so useful. People traditionally see cholesterol as good versus bad. We're slowly moving away from that very simplified reductionist view. And then we're moving into HDL versus LDL. But even then, there's sort of so many different subgroups and factors within that, from total cholesterol to ApoB to the sort of very low density lipoproteins. And so actually, I think if you just looked at someone's total cholesterol level, that probably doesn't tell you anything useful about their cardiovascular health at all. And even if you just had an idea of their LDL and HDL, it probably wouldn't tell you, again, too much more. You need to, sort of know what, the specifics of the breakdowns of the LDL. What can someone do who is maybe in their 30s, who's maybe doing annual blood tests as a screen, as a marker of their health, when they're looking at their cholesterol markers and maybe it's, higher than expected? Is there anything someone can do proactively to start to improve their brain health from that point of view?
That's a great question, and such an important one too. I always joke that neurology is about 10 to 20 years later behind cardiology when it comes to data on cardiovascular risk factors and its impact on the end organ. And we now know that there's a huge overlap between vascular risk factors and neurodegenerative conditions. As far as cholesterol is concerned, so far the data shows that uncontrolled total cholesterol and specifically LDL cholesterol can increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease later on. And addressing it during midlife is more important. There have been studies that show that during late life, when LDL is lowered, whether it's with medication or lifestyle, it doesn't do much as far as that objective and the final risk is concerned. So it seems that, again, the concept of cumulative risk leading to the disease is fortified by this example. And LDL cholesterol seems to be a major risk factor for if someone is in their, say, for example, 20s, 30s, and 40s, and they find out that their total cholesterol and specifically LDL cholesterol is high, it's very important for them to consider lowering it. We're all for lifestyle, of course, with eating the right kind of diet. You talk about how important fiber is, cutting out saturated fats from their diet. Those all have been associated with lowering of LDL later on in life. But even in some medications where LDL is lowered with medication, that actually seems to lower the risk for Alzheimer's disease later on as well. And as far as mechanism is concerned, a lot of people think that because the brain is made out of fat, it needs a lot of fat. But when you say fat, which kind of fat are you talking about? And you look at it mechanistically, there's really no system for the brain cells to take in saturated fats or cholesterol. The brain actually makes its own cholesterol, and there's no mechanism for saturated fats to go into the brain. The only kind of fat that we need on a regular basis are the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, and that can come from food or supplementation for those who need it more. And we have a lot of large databases that show that, say, for example, in a few years ago, a paper was published on Northern California, Kaiser Permanente Northern California study. Almost 10,000 people followed for 30 years, so decades of data. And you can almost see a dose-response relationship between LDL going up with risk of Alzheimer's going up. And there are multiple other studies that show that when saturated fatty acids, which could increase LDL cholesterol, when that's consumed in large amounts, that could increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease as well. So from multiple lines of study, when you look at this data, you can tell that it is an important risk factor. And, the Lancet Commission actually highlighted it as an important risk factor during midlife.
And I guess that's why we're seeing rates of, one of the reasons potentially why we may be seeing rates of dementia and Alzheimer's creeping up when we see other chronic diseases potentially like cancer going down. One, you could argue, is because of increased diagnosis and awareness, but also, we're living in an age where I guess people are over-consuming. There's rising metabolic disease, and that comes with potentially an associated increased LDL. And there's this sort of insidious creep of LDL potentially contributing, to this sort of long-term cognitive decline from that sense. And just to pick up, Dean, on something you mentioned earlier, you made that association where, people on social media and online talk about Alzheimer's and dementia being type 3 diabetes, I guess I see some parallels between that and when people talk about leaky gut syndrome when it comes to sort of gut physiology, where there's maybe a kernel of truth there somewhere, but it's a bit of a buzz phrase used to fearmonger people, because clearly when someone says type 3 diabetes, Alzheimer's, they're trying to refer to this insulin resistance, metabolic, aberration. But then, it's not because of increased sugar consumption. It's got nothing to do with diabetes, although diabetes could increase your risk of Alzheimer's. And I guess that is where some pseudoscience creeps in and makes people worry about carbohydrates. And then they don't eat carbohydrates, they don't eat fiber, and then they eat lots of meat. And short term, they maybe get some boost of energy, they feel good. But long term, they're probably contributing to abnormal lipid levels and then maybe even an increased risk of Alzheimer's.
I'm very optimistic human being in general. I'm a history buff, and I'm even more optimistic now in today's social media world. This battle we're having with complexity is not a bad thing, because for every misinformation, there's two or three other people coming up with complexity. And ourselves, this scientific humility, I don't believe in scientific humility, we've evolved our information because we're open to change, right? One thing that you brought up right now, even cholesterol, our view of cholesterol changed over the last 10 years. And I have no shame in that, because my mechanism is not absolute. It's not dependent on me. It's dependent on a mechanism of how to find the truth, which frees me. Even our relation with LDL will change. Right now, it's a blunt concept. But I guarantee you in 5 years, we'll see that LDL in this person, with this gene, with these proteomics, with this genomics, with this, will be different than this person. That evolving complexity is not a weakness of science. It's not a quirk of science. It's a most beautiful feature of science. An ever-evolving system that finds closer and closer proximity to the truth. And if we, you, I, and everybody else, doesn't bombast and doesn't pick on one concept as the end-all, be-all, and looks at this as an evolving process, but based on a system that we all agree on, we have just lifted the floor of consciousness of humanity. And that's why I'm optimistic. I'm not gonna saint you right now or knight you right now, but people like you and others, and hopefully us as well, our information is not dependent on a thing. We're plant-based, but we don't push plant-based diet. We say you can be healthy not being plant-based. Just eat more plants, and even there take certain. Our methodology is dependent on methodology, not on Sherzai or on this guy or that guy, or not even some Nobel Prize winners, because all Nobel Prize winners go crazy on their second endeavor. It's a method of science that relies on data and evolution of that data and complexity, and I love it. And I'm seeing people becoming aware of it. I'm seeing people not knowing that anecdote means nothing. My migraines, horrible migraines, went away the moment I went plant-based. Never say anything about that. Went away from 2 migraines a week to 0. You know why I don't bring it up? Because something else happened at around the same time. This is called confound of science. I married this human being. And at the same time, I moved to California.
Did I make it worse?
No, it went away. And at the same time, I had less stress. And at the same time, I took some. So anecdote means nothing, no matter how phenomenal it would be. It means nothing. Science is evolving. Our relationship with food and even specific elements like LDL, HDL, all that is becoming more complex. And the most important thing I want the audience, your audience and everybody, we always say, don't create icons. Don't create Sherzai as icon. If the next thing coming out of my mouth is based on valid, repeatable, and directional data, then you say, okay, I have a fair bit of confidence. So I love the work you do and how you promulgate information in that way.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on all those points you mentioned, because science is a ever-changing medium. The needle is always changing. It's being open to accepting changes is a marker of a true scientist, which you guys do constantly. I guess one of the things we haven't touched on in too much detail so far, which is unquestionably, the science has backed this up for likely decades, is the link between sleep and cognitive decline and dementia. And I think for me, the wake up moment was when I read Why We Sleep by Matt Walker. And that really clarified things for me mechanistically as to why it's so important, and this buildup of toxic proteins. Ayesha, you mentioned the accumulation of amyloid plaques and proteins can, flourish when you don't get enough sleep and enough of that, cerebrospinal fluid washing through that junk that accumulates. But, even if we just park the sleep issue, which is a necessity for humans, specifically within sleep, if you have abnormalities like obstructive sleep apnea, that itself, disruptions in basic sleep physiology can be a significant compounding factor at raising your risk as well. Like if you're waking up tired and really groggy and you're snoring, that also could be a huge alarm bell for you to seek some medical attention, because beyond just bad sleep, that's in bad health, and you're raising your risk of dementias, several times just based on having sleep apnea itself.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought that up, because sleep disorders, and particularly sleep apnea, is an epidemic in the United States, with all of the metabolic issues kind of creating this messy picture of whether it's metabolic disruption and high blood pressure and being overweight, and all of that can actually really, it could amplify that problem. Sleep apnea itself, in several studies, can increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease by anywhere between 60 to 70%. And if you look at studies where they have implemented a treatment for sleep apnea, whether it's wearing a CPAP machine or some sort of device, that dentists could potentially give for patients, that completely disrupts that relationship, and you have lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. And when you look at the sleep architecture, something really fascinating happens. So two very important things happen when we sleep. The first thing that happens is memory consolidation. All of the short-term and the working memory widgets, they get converted into long-term memory during the deeper stages of sleep. So we have N1, N2, and N3. And N3 is that state where memory consolidation happens. And the second thing that happens is this elegant glymphatic system comes to life, which is essentially the brain's garbage disposal system. And it constitutes of a lymph, or a fluid, as well as specific cells, the microglia, that gets activated. And it literally grows around the brain and gets all the debris out so that the brain is fresh and at working at a performance level the next day. That doesn't happen when people have sleep apnea. Well, first of all, you wake up so many times that you rarely go to the deeper stages of sleep. And then second, along with sleep apnea comes other vascular risk factors like high blood pressure. And people tend to actually have very poor cerebral blood flow when they have blood circulation disruption. So it's really, really important for people to know. Other sleep disorders are restless leg syndrome, where you are not allowed to be in that deeper stage of sleep for that elegant glymphatic system to start working and for your memories to be consolidated. And it does increase risk for Alzheimer's disease now.
One important thing which we haven't touched on right now, and I'm learning more about this as the science of it evolves, is just the role of various populations of microbiomes in different organ systems, which could influence our risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. And I think the best data we have, seems to be, I would say, correlative data, but maybe eventually might turn into causative data, is about kind of oral hygiene and the oral microbiome, and the degree of your oral and dental health and how that could influence your risk of Alzheimer's. If you have, it seems on large epidemiological data that if you have tooth loss, gum problems, chronic gingivitis, things like that, you might have an dysbiotic or abnormal oral microbiome. And if you have this, you likely have some systemic inflammation, which starts in the mouth and goes to the rest of the body. And those inflammatory mediators may hitchhike to the brain and also, provide a sort of a medium for chaos to happen in the brain and Alzheimer's dementia risk as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting relationship. And for a long period of time, the directionality of the association was questioned, which basically means, is it because people have memory problems and they forget to take care of their oral health? Is it that? Or is it truly people not paying attention to their oral health leading to cognitive impairment later on? And over the past 10 years, especially with the team at Columbia University, some of my mentors have actually looked into it. And there truly is a very clear relationship between oral and dental health and cognitive impairment later on. We haven't really been able to kind of identify that complex relationship as of yet. And the same goes for the gut microbiome as well. We're now learning more and more about dysbiosis and how that can impact the blood-brain barrier and could potentially be a very strong risk factor for cognitive decline as we age. But it is a signal, and we all need to pay attention to it. So, very simple things like flossing and brushing your teeth and getting it checked every 6 months with a dentist and getting your teeth cleaned and addressing any dental issues or oral hygiene issues is critically important for brain health.
I think even if we can't find any strong evidence to prove causation between the two, it's no loss to just, take care of your oral health and eat more fiber, because, if we do find there is that causal link between the gut and the brain and the oral microbiome and the brain, and we can prove they're directly, related bidirectionally, it makes no difference if you do take care of your, oral health or gut health, because, the sort of change you make is small and the wins could be huge just by changing those small lifestyle factors. Right now, I don't necessarily buy that if you eat X food, it could improve your brain. And I think right now we know in the gut microbiome space, certainly we know that A can do B, B can do C, C can do D. And a lot of people are jumping then saying A can do D. We don't have the causal link chain to say that, every step can do everything. And I think people are jumping the gun a little bit, maybe to sell supplements, maybe to sell some dream or, their opinion maybe. And it sounds sexy, eat X and it can prevent Alzheimer's. Like, I think recently something trending on social media was about how lion's mane mushroom can prevent Alzheimer's, or top 3 supplements or top 3 foods to prevent Alzheimer's. And it sells someone a dream, right? Like, wow, okay, I can do this.
Beautifully stated, and couldn't agree more. I think as physicians, it's our responsibility to make sure that while we empower our patients to take care of themselves, we also give them tools to not get lost in the superfood of the day and not give them false promises. As a neurologist working in a hospital, in a community, in a clinic, and also having this platform on social media, I see a lot of that misinformation. Like, for example, the lion mane study that you brought up. They're basically 2 studies, Karan, and it was done on Japanese men who ate a ton of lion's mane mushroom, which, by the way, is so expensive. It is so expensive. You can just get a small little, like 5-ounce lion's mane, and that's more than, a person's cost of meal for the entire day. So it's unusual. And when you look at the outcome, the cognitive testing that they used were not the same. The little bump that you saw, there were so many other confounding factors. So it's really sad that these kind of studies are magnified in the population, and everybody is running to get the superfood of the day or the supplement of the day. And in many ways, for a lot of people who are suffering from Alzheimer's disease and from cognitive impairment, that's false hope. And I kind of feel like it's borderline criminal to magnify the benefits of some food product or some supplement when there is really no objective evidence to support it.
Do you think more people could benefit from reassessing their own diets and maybe their own health as well? For example, like you guys are plant-based, maybe someone who's just starting their plant-based journey. We know that vegans and vegetarians may be at higher risk of B12 deficiency compared to, someone who's eating high amounts of meat, although, that's not an issue if you have a diverse, varied diet. But, B12 has a role in influencing memory, the brain, etc., and brain health in general. So if someone is chronically deficient of B12 for months and years, they are raising their risk inadvertently of cognitive decline and Alzheimer's. So is there a role for someone to actually be proactive about things like iron, B12, omega-3s, and all these sort of other key nutrients and micronutrients in their diet to ensure they're not deficient in that, and supplement or change their diet as appropriate?
We have to be. The world, the public health, and my background is public health. And one thing I'm going to tell people is going to shock them. There are national databases that show that just fortification of food with iodine raise the IQs of entire nations.
Mm.
When people say go natural, I'm saying, or go paleo, I'm saying, yeah, go ahead if you expect to live 39 years. Yeah, that's how long we live. We're cheating evolution. We're cheating it, and I'm okay with it. I love it, and I'm going to keep cheating it. And part of that is B12 for not just the vegans, of course, vegans definitely, but as much as 40% of U.S. and developed world is B12 deficient. Another one is vitamin D. Vitamin D is so important, not just for brain and all the other functions and myelination and everything else, but for health in general. In California, we live in California. We live on the beach. We had patients who live with us here that are vitamin D deficient, and the numbers are just overwhelming. So get it checked. And then once you've checked it, then maybe you need a supplementation. The other one is omega-3. We did 2 massive reviews, comprehensive reviews. One on omega-3 and the developing brain, and omega-3 and the aging brain. Yeah, people who eat fish have less risk as far as omega-3 is concerned. And here it is from a plant-based person. Eating fish once or twice a week actually seem to be beneficial for people. That's a reality. We don't know the data on microplastics. We don't know the data on toxins. But in general, people who ate fatty fish were healthier. That's the data we have to go by. But you can get that benefit from supplementation. You can get that benefit from chia, flaxseed, or otherwise. But you have to be aware that omega-3, specifically for the brain, it's DHA, which makes more than 50% of your brain, is not produced by your body. So you're going to have to get it somewhere. So a planned diet, a plant lifestyle is important. The most important part of that is planned. There are parts that need to be addressed. B12, vitamin D, and omega-3. And then as we learn more, probably more. But when people tell you specific, unusual things without data behind it, that's salesmanship. And that's dangerous. So I fully agree with you that we have to be aware of these things. For plant-based people, it's certain things. For others, it's other things. But if we plan it well based on data, we really significantly affect not just our brain health, but our health in general.
To just pick up on your points about salesmanship when it comes to supplements, recently there's been an uptick in the number of, discourses online about the sort of reported benefits of high dose creatine on cognitive health. I think even studies, reviewing creatine in the context of depression and low mood symptoms, and even creatine high dose on mitigating the negative effects of acute sleep deprivation as well. And we know, obviously, that there's a ton of research on the physical benefits and recovery benefits of creatine, and maybe even some early evidence of cardiovascular protection. But this sort of neuroprotective benefits, for me, seems a little bit far-fetched. I mean, maybe it could be slightly a consequence of just general recovery. But I don't know. Like, I've not seen consistent high-quality data to say that, you can take creatine for brain health. But that seems to be the sort of message now purported by people online to maybe, sell this glorified version of creatine beyond, its remit almost.
Yes, no, I completely agree with you. I think you stated it beautifully. Just recently, I put a reel together on social media on creatine because it was one of the most popular questions. Should I take creatine for brain health? And when you look at the data, like you said, it's been tested in a small group of people, and you know that something has to be tested in a larger group of people for a longer period of time, and then for neurologists or physicians to have a consensus about it, and then that's when you actually suggested for public health and for prevention of particular diseases. We don't have that kind of data on creatine. Most of the studies are in a small group of people, and there are no more than 3 to 6 months of follow-up. And when you look at the cognitive testing and the outcome, the change from baseline to the ultimate result was incredibly small. It seems like you said, it helps people when they're under duress, so sleepless nights, or when they are in some sort of a stressful situation. It seems that the delta, or the difference between the baseline cognitive testing and the ultimate test, is a little higher, but that's too small of a signal for us to start recommending it for everyone. So unlike the profound, robust data that creatine helps building muscle, we really don't have anything like that for cognition. So I'd say, yeah, take it for your muscles, but it's not really going to do anything for your brain.
Now, it looks like, in terms of the split, the demographic split of Alzheimer's cases and in dementia in general, it's heavily skewed towards women. I think nearly 2/3 of Alzheimer's diagnoses are in women. Is that just because of some gender specific, differences in physiology? Or is there actually some difference in sort of the brain architecture which predisposes, women to, be diagnosed at increasing rates compared to men?
It's an area that is still being investigated. It's a burgeoning field to look at the risk factors of Alzheimer's disease in women. We know that from several studies that, for example, lipid metabolism and how women's bodies respond to vascular risk factors, whether it's abnormal cholesterol panel or abnormal blood pressure, is different when it comes to men. We also know that midlife risk factors, and especially the perimenopausal period, even 10 years before menopause occurs, the women's body goes through a lot of physiological and neurological changes, because estrogen is a very, very important factor in memory creation and in brain health. So the changes in estrogen and progesterone and how the brain responds to it is massive. And we're learning more about that. So the combination of how the vascular risk factors, other metabolic risk factors, as well as perimenopausal risk factors, combined together, they do impact the brain differently and may increase the risk factors for women more than men. Beyond that, I think there are some other factors that we're still learning. One of the theories that Dean and I are working on, and I'll let you speak about this more, is the women that, tend to be in their 70s and 80s at this day and age had very different lives in the past. One of the things that we think is a factor that is not really being considered is the cognitive reserve theory. Being involved in decision making, having had that rich, challenging, and complex lives was not something that women were exposed to. Could this, now that it's changing with women having jobs and being more outgoing and being more involved in the society, could this actually build the cognitive resilience that you were talking about, Dean, earlier in the nun study? Could this actually change the relationship going further? I don't know. Hopefully. So, I'm so happy that we're collecting data, and there are a lot of long-term data and studies that look at the complexity of all of these risk factors going hand in hand. That said, women need to be very, very aware of their midlife risk factors moving forward, and especially during the perimenopausal area.
Yeah, I think probably it speaks volumes about maybe the lack of knowledge and research in women's health in general, but also niching down on women's brain health. And I guess, I don't know, you can correct me if I'm, slightly speaking out of turn here, but also we know that I guess women in the menopause stage have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and whether that then contributes to also the sort of Alzheimer's disease risk as well, with abnormal lipid levels, gut dysbiosis as well. There's some disruptions in the gut, whether that's also some contributing factor. I guess there's a lot of leaves to uncover there to find out actually what's going on and why are women getting Alzheimer's higher diagnostic rates than men.
Very well said. Yes.
And then the one other factor, which is they live longer, 5 to 7 years longer. And those 5 to 7 years at the end of life are profound in manifestation of disease as well. So it's a combination of things, and a lot of them are potentially modifiable. So again, there's a lot of research that will be done in the next few years to elucidate that.
There's one thing that's when we talk about perimenopause and menopause, there's obviously a lot more positive awareness about the deficiencies of various hormones from progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone, which happens in women at that stage of life, and how they would benefit from vaginal symptoms, sexual dysfunction symptoms, hot flashes, in some cases, and even, offsetting the loss of bone density in taking some sort of hormonal replacement therapy. But I guess this is where some misinformation still exists, and some people kind of really push the packet on saying that hormone therapy can reduce rates of cognitive decline and do all of these great things. And I think, that sort of menopause space is really divided, where there's a lot of people, physicians, practitioners, as well as patients who've taken this, who subscribe to that, this is a panacea for women in perimenopause and menopause. And then there's a slightly more conservative view that yes, it can be great if you have XYZ indications.
Yes, for many years we were divided. And I think it kind of started with the Women's Health Initiative paper that came out back in 2003 that showed that women who were getting hormone replacement therapy had higher risk of cancer and cardiovascular disease. And then for a good 10 to 15 years, there was just a lull. Everybody stopped giving hormone replacement therapy for women. And now we actually have some really good data, human data, that shows that there is a very particular period in a woman's life where hormone replacement therapy can make a huge difference. So it's not yes or no, it's who will benefit from it, at what stage of their life, and with what type of hormone, whether it's estrogen only or estrogen and progesterone, whether it's testosterone. So again, we kind of come back to this concept of personalized medicine where someone knows their risk factors and gets the right kind of medication or therapy for that. But I think we're learning more and more that it's not a yes and no question, it's when and who.
Oh, absolutely. Personalized medicine in that form is key. And also, I guess people, women who have perimenopause, menopause in that stage of life, they're at higher risk of, low mood, brain fog, maybe some degree of sort of, memory loss, or it's not as great as it used to be during that phase. And some, in specific cases, women who maybe have those symptoms, those sort of neurological symptoms, even if it's transient, and then they take HRT or some sort of therapy and experience a reversal or at least some symptomatic relief from those neurological symptoms from a cognitive point of view, maybe that's where this sort of drive to say it can help to reverse Alzheimer's or prevent Alzheimer's comes from. Because I think according to any menopause guidelines and hormone therapy guidelines, there's no high quality human trials to suggest that HRT specifically can offset cognitive decline, which I used to, subscribe to that thing. I thought it could do, but I think the evidence suggests maybe it can't.
I agree. I don't think we have that kind of a high quality evidence showing that it can offset the risk for Alzheimer's disease. It does improve symptoms. We have that data so far, but we don't have long enough of data for us to suggest that it can, change that pathogenetic relationship. But I think it's important for women to note that these symptoms during their menopause is temporary, that, with a good dose of lifestyle, whether that's improving their sleep or focusing on exercise and eating well and increasing their fiber and taking care of their gut microbiome and having meaningful relationship in their life and something to keep them challenged at all times is a good thing. We always forget about the impact that lifestyle has on these symptoms. And there's profound data that shows that when women decide to live a healthy lifestyle and they identify their risk factors, they can manage it very, very well.
I hope someone listening to this conversation can really come away with a lot of optimism and hope, and that dementia needn't be this death sentence, and that it's going to just can strike you at random, and then you're sort of consigned to this lifestyle. And that really there are a lot of modifiable risk factors that we have in our control to at least change your own destinies. And if anyone doesn't follow you already, you are one of the, if not you guys, the best resources online for anything about the brain. So I just really want to thank you coming on here and having this chat and enlightening everybody.
That's very kind of you, Karan. Thank you so much. That means a lot coming from you. We feel the same about you. Yeah, we've dedicated our life to this. Having had the privilege of taking care of elderly family members in our household who had dementia, we're very familiar with how this awful disease just slowly and gradually takes pieces of a person and steals their memories and their personalities away from them. But at the same time, there's so much we can do. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an elite privileged package that only a certain number of people can get. Very simple things like you said, maintaining a healthy diet, exercising, managing our stresses, getting a good night's sleep, and keeping our minds active can do wonders for the brain and can prevent this devastating disease.
And it starts today. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.